Margaret Sinclair had everything a woman could want. A sprawling Victorian mansion in the prestigious Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, a successful investment banker husband, and enough money to never worry about tomorrow. But chronic fibromyalgia had stolen her strength, leaving her trapped in a body that betrayed her daily. When her husband David hired 23-year-old Elena Rodriguez to help around the house, Margaret thought her prayers had been answered. The young woman was efficient, caring, and seemed to anticipate Margaret's every need. But the hidden security cameras throughout their home would soon reveal a truth so shocking that it would shatter everything Margaret believed about trust, manipulation, and the people we invite into our most private spaces. Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sinclair mansion, casting long shadows across the Italian marble floors that Margaret could no longer clean herself. She sat in her favorite armchair, a plush burgundy recliner, positioned strategically near the bay window where she could watch the world go by, a world she increasingly felt disconnected from. At 42, Margaret had once been the kind of woman who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar real estate deals with a handshake. She had climbed mountains in Nepal, run marathons in New York, and built a successful property development company from nothing. Her life had been motion, ambition, and endless possibility. That was before the diagnosis. Fibromyalgia had crept into her life like a thief in the night, stealing first her energy, then her confidence, and finally her independence. The chronic pain condition left her muscles aching as if she'd been hit by a truck, her joints stiff and uncooperative, and her mind clouded by what doctors called fibro fog, a mental haze that made even simple tasks feel insurmountable. The irony wasn't lost on her. She lived in a 6-bedroom mansion worth $12 million, complete with a chef's kitchen she could barely use, a home gym that mocked her daily, and enough space to house a small village. Yet she felt imprisoned within its walls, dependent on others for the most basic tasks. David had tried to understand. Her husband of 15 years was a good man, methodical, successful, and genuinely caring in his own analytical way. As a senior partner at Goldman Sachs, he approached problems like investment portfolios, identify the issue, research solutions, allocate resources, and execute the plan. When Margaret's condition worsened 6 months ago, leaving her struggling to manage even simple household tasks, David had done what he did best. He'd hired help. "We need someone full-time," he'd announced one evening over dinner, his tone matter-of-fact as he cut into his perfectly prepared salmon. "Someone who can help with the house, assist you with daily activities, maybe even provide some companionship." During the day, Margaret had bristled at the suggestion. "I'm not an invalid, David, I can manage," but they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The previous week she'd collapsed while trying to carry a load of laundry upstairs, her legs simply giving out beneath her. David had found her at the bottom of the staircase, surrounded by scattered clothes, tears streaming down her face, not from physical pain, but from the humiliation of her own helplessness. The hiring process had been swift and efficient, handled primarily by David's assistant, who had connections with several domestic placement agencies in the city. They'd interviewed 3 candidates, but Elena Rodriguez had stood out immediately. Elena was 23, petite but strong, with warm brown eyes and an infectious smile that seemed to light up whatever room she entered. She'd immigrated from Colombia 5 years earlier, working her way through community college while caring for her elderly grandmother and younger brother. Her English was accented but clear, and she spoke with a genuine warmth that immediately put Margaret at ease. "Mrs. Sinclair," Elena had said during their first meeting, her voice soft but confident, "I understand what it's like to feel like your body isn't cooperating with your mind. My grandmother had arthritis very bad, and I learned that sometimes the most important thing isn't what you can't do. It's finding new ways to do what matters most to you. It was exactly what Margaret needed to hear. Elena's references were impeccable. She'd worked for 3 other wealthy families in the Boston area, and each had provided glowing recommendations. Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, a prominent society matron from Cambridge, had written a particularly enthusiastic letter praising Elena's exceptional attention to detail, absolute trustworthiness, and remarkable ability to anticipate needs before they're even expressed. The salary David offered was generous. $60,000 a year plus room and board, health insurance, and 2 weeks paid vacation. Elena would live in the converted apartment above the garage, a space that had previously housed David's collection of vintage cars before his interest had shifted to wine. On Elena's first day, Margaret had felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Relief because she desperately needed the help, embarrassment because accepting it felt like admitting defeat. She'd always been fiercely independent, the kind of woman who changed her own oil and fixed her own leaky faucets. Now she needed help, getting out of bed on her worst days. Elena had arrived at 7 in the morning sharp, carrying a small suitcase and a cloth bag that smelled faintly of herbs and spices. She'd declined Margaret's offer of coffee, instead insisting on making tea, a special blend, she'd explained, that her grandmother used to prepare for her arthritis. "In Colombia, we believe food is medicine," Elena had said, bustling around the kitchen with surprising familiarity. "This tea has turmeric, ginger, and a few secret ingredients. It won't cure anything, but it might help with the inflammation." The tea had been delicious, warming Margaret from the inside out in a way that felt both comforting and unfamiliar. She'd found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, the constant tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. Elena's efficiency was remarkable. Within her first week, she'd reorganized the entire kitchen, creating what she called accessibility zones. Areas where everything Margaret might need was within easy reach. She'd rearranged the living room furniture to create clearer pathways and installed subtle grab bars in the bathrooms that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. But it was Elena's intuition that truly impressed Margaret. The young woman seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to read Margaret's needs before she expressed them. If Margaret was having a particularly difficult morning, Eleanor would appear with a heating pad and that special tea. If Margaret felt restless and trapped, Elena would suggest a gentle walk in the garden or a drive to the nearby botanical gardens. "How do you always know exactly what I need?" Margaret had asked one afternoon as Elena helped her into a warm bath infused with lavender and Epsom salts. Elena had smiled, her hands gentle as she adjusted the water temperature. "My grandmother taught me to watch and listen, not just with my ears but with my heart. Pain speaks its own language if you know how to hear it." The transformation in Margaret's daily life was dramatic. For the first time in months, she began to feel glimpses of her old self. Elena encouraged her to continue her physical therapy, exercises, even modifying them when Margaret's pain was particularly intense. She learned to prepare meals that were anti-inflammatory, delicious, and perfectly portioned. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, handling everything from grocery shopping to coordinating with maintenance workers. Most importantly, Elena provided companionship without pity. She didn't treat Margaret like a fragile invalid, or speak to her in the overly cheerful tones that well-meaning friends often used. Instead, she engaged Margaret in conversations about books, current events, and even business. Eleanor was surprisingly well-read for someone so young, and Margaret found herself looking forward to their daily discussions over lunch. David noticed the change immediately. His wife was brighter, more engaged, and seemed to be managing her pain better than she had in months. The constant worry lines around his eyes began to soften as he watched Margaret laugh at something Elena had said over dinner, or saw her moving more confidently around the house. "Elena's been wonderful," he'd commented one evening as they prepared for bed. "I can't believe the difference she's made in just a few weeks." Margaret had nodded, feeling genuinely grateful for the first time since her diagnosis had turned their lives upside down. "She's not just helping with the house, David. She's helping me remember who I am." It was true. Elena had managed to create an environment where Margaret felt supported without feeling helpless, cared for without feeling pitied. The young woman had a gift, an ability to provide assistance while preserving dignity, to offer help while maintaining respect. But there were small things that Margaret had begun to notice, tiny details that didn't quite add up. Eleanor's familiarity with their house had been impressive from day one, almost as if she'd been there before. She'd known exactly where to find the spare keys, had located the main water shutoff valve without asking, and had immediately understood the quirks of their temperamental security system. When Margaret had mentioned this to David, he'd laughed it off. "She's probably just experienced with houses like ours. These old Victorians all have similar layouts and systems." Still, there were other things. Eleanor received very few phone calls or visitors, which seemed unusual for someone her age. She rarely talked about her life outside their home, deflecting personal questions with gentle humor and changing the subject. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret thought she heard footsteps moving through the house, soft, careful steps that could have been Elena checking on things, but somehow felt different. Margaret had also noticed that Elena seemed particularly interested in David's home office, often lingering near the doorway when she was dusting the hallway outside. The office was where David kept his most important documents, investment portfolios, client information, and personal financial records. It was always locked when David wasn't home, but Elena had asked several times if she should clean inside. "Mr. David is so organized," Elena had commented one morning while arranging fresh flowers near the office door. "I bet he has everything perfectly filed and labeled in there." The observation had struck Margaret as oddly specific, though she couldn't quite articulate why. It was the kind of comment that felt like fishing for information. Though Eleanor's tone had been casual and conversational, there were other small inconsistencies too. Elena claimed to send most of her salary back to her family in Colombia, yet she seemed to have an endless supply of high-quality personal care items and expensive-looking clothes. Her phone was always the latest model, and Margaret had glimpsed what looked like a very expensive watch on Elena's wrist during one of their afternoon walks. When Margaret had casually asked about the watch, Elena had quickly pulled her sleeve down and explained that it was a gift from a previous employer, a family heirloom that had been passed down to her as a token of appreciation for her years of service. The explanation had been plausible, but something about Elena's body language in that moment had felt off. She'd become suddenly self-conscious in a way that was uncharacteristic for someone who was usually so poised and confident. Margaret found herself paying closer attention to these small details, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being unfairly suspicious of someone who had shown her nothing but kindness and competence. Elena had transformed her daily existence from one of struggle and isolation to something approaching normalcy and contentment. Was it fair to question her motives based on minor inconsistencies and half-formed suspicions? Perhaps it was the chronic pain medication affecting her judgment, or maybe it was simply the paranoia that sometimes accompanied her condition. Fibromyalgia didn't just affect the body, it could also impact mental clarity and emotional stability. Margaret had learned to question her own perceptions during her worst episodes, when the fog in her brain made even simple decisions feel overwhelming. But as she watched Elena move through their home with such practiced efficiency, as she observed, the young woman's uncanny ability to anticipate needs and navigate their lives with almost supernatural intuition, Margaret couldn't quite silence the small voice in the back of her mind that whispered, "What if there's more to this than kindness? What if Elena's perfection is too good to be true?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks into Elena's employment, David made a decision that would change everything. He'd been growing increasingly concerned about Margaret's safety, particularly after she'd experienced a severe flare-up that left her disoriented and weak for 2 days straight. The incident had occurred while he was in New York for a client meeting, leaving Elena to manage Margaret's care entirely on her own. "I want to install a comprehensive security system," David announced over breakfast on a crisp October morning. "Not just for break-ins, but for health monitoring. If something happens to you while I'm away, I want to be able to respond immediately." Margaret looked up from her oatmeal, surprised by the sudden decision. "David, that seems excessive. Elena's here during the day and you're usually home by evening. But what if Elena steps out for groceries and you fall? What if you have a medical emergency in the middle of the night?" David's voice carried the weight of genuine worry. "I've been researching systems that can detect falls, monitor vital signs, even alert emergency services automatically. It's not about not trusting Elena, it's about having backup protection." Elena, who had been quietly arranging fresh orchids in a crystal vase nearby, paused in her work. "That sounds very smart, Mr. David. Mrs. Margaret's safety should always come first." Her response was perfectly supportive, but Margaret caught something in Elena's expression, a fleeting shadow that crossed her features before the young woman resumed her warm smile. It was barely perceptible, gone so quickly that Margaret wondered if she'd imagined it. The installation team arrived the following Monday. TechShield Security was one of Boston's premier companies, specializing in high-end residential systems for wealthy clients who demanded both protection and discretion. The lead technician, Marcus Chen, was a soft-spoken man in his 30s who treated their home with the reverence of someone working in a museum. "We'll be installing a hybrid system," Marcus explained as he walked them through the house, tablet in hand. Traditional motion sensors and door alarms, but also advanced cameras with facial recognition, sound detection, and behavioral analysis capabilities. The cameras are small, about the size of a button, and virtually invisible once installed. Margaret watched Elena during this explanation. The young woman followed the tour with polite interest, asking thoughtful questions about how the system would impact daily routines. But Margaret noticed that Elena paid particular attention to the placement of cameras, carefully noting which rooms would be monitored and which angles would be covered. "Will there be cameras in the bedrooms?" Elena asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "No," Marcus replied. "Mr. Sinclair specifically requested privacy in personal spaces. We'll cover all common areas, hallways, the kitchen and outdoor perimeters, but bedrooms and bathrooms remain private." Elena nodded approvingly. "That's very respectful. Some families I've worked for weren't as considerate of their staff's privacy." Team. Installation took 3 days. Marcus and his team worked with surgical precision, running cables through walls, positioning sensors in strategic locations, and configuring the central monitoring station in David's office. Elena was unfailingly helpful throughout the process, offering the workers coffee and sandwiches, even suggesting optimal camera angles to avoid glare from windows. Her helpfulness struck Margaret as oddly proactive. Most domestic staff would simply stay out of the way during such installations, but Elena seemed genuinely invested in ensuring the system worked perfectly. She asked technical questions about the software, inquired about remote access capabilities, and even requested a brief tutorial on how to arm and disarm various zones. "I want to be able to help Mrs. Margaret if she forgets the codes," Elena explained when Marcus raised an eyebrow at her detailed questions. "Sometimes the pain medication affects her memory, and I don't want her to feel frustrated with the technology." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, delivered with Elena's characteristic warmth and concern. Yet something about it felt rehearsed to Margaret, as if Elena had prepared the justification in advance. On the final day of installation, Marcus demonstrated the system's capabilities to the entire household. The central control panel in David's office displayed feeds from 27 cameras strategically positioned throughout the mansion and grounds. The images were crystal clear, updating in real time with artificial intelligence that could distinguish between family members, staff, visitors, and potential intruders. "The system learns your patterns," Marcus explained, pointing to various analytical readings on the screen. "It will recognize normal movement patterns and alert you to anything unusual. For instance, if Mrs. Sinclair typically goes to the kitchen at 8 a.m. but doesn't appear by 10 a.m., the system can send an alert to your phone." Elena stood behind them, watching the demonstration with rapt attention. Margaret observed her reflection in the computer monitor and was struck by the intensity of Elena's focus. The young woman wasn't just politely interested, she was studying every detail of the system's operation with the concentration of someone memorizing critical information. "Can the system be accessed remotely?" Elena asked. "In case Mr. David is traveling and needs to check on Mrs. Margaret?" "Absolutely," Marcus confirmed. "Mr. Sinclair will have full access through a secure app on his phone and laptop. He can view live feeds, review recorded footage, and even communicate through the system's intercom function." "What about recorded footage?" David inquired. "How long is it stored? Standard package includes 30 days of rolling storage, but we can expand that to 90 days or more if needed. All footage is encrypted and stored on local servers, so there's no cloud vulnerability." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "And who else would have access to these recordings?" Marcus glanced at David before answering. "Only the primary account holder, Mr. Sinclair, and anyone he specifically authorizes. We recommend limiting access for security purposes." That evening, after the installation team had departed and the system was fully operational, David gave Margaret a comprehensive tutorial on the basic functions. Elena hovered nearby, ostensibly tidying the office, but clearly listening to every instruction. "The beauty of this system is that it's completely passive," David explained, as he showed Margaret how to view different camera angles. "You don't have to do anything special. It's always watching, always learning, always ready to help if you need it." Margaret felt a strange chill at his words. Always watching. The phrase echoed in her mind as she looked at the grid of camera feeds displaying various rooms of their home. In the kitchen feed, she could see Elena preparing dinner, moving with her characteristic grace and efficiency. In the living room feed, the afternoon light cast long shadows across the furniture. The garden feed showed their landscapers' recent work on the autumn flower beds. It was comprehensive surveillance, designed with the best of intentions, but somehow feeling invasive despite being in their own home. Margaret tried to shake off the unsettled feeling. This was for her safety, her protection. David was being thoughtful and proactive, not paranoid or controlling, but as the days passed, Margaret found herself hyper-aware of the camera's presence. She moved through her home differently, conscious that her every action was being recorded and analyzed. It wasn't that she had anything to hide, it was simply the psychological weight of knowing she was constantly under observation. Elena, by contrast, seemed completely unaffected by the new surveillance. If anything, she appeared more relaxed than before, moving through her duties with the same natural grace she'd always displayed. She never glanced at the cameras or seemed to modify her behavior in any way that acknowledged their presence. The system's first alert came 4 days after installation. Margaret was having a particularly difficult morning, her fibromyalgia flaring severely enough that she'd decided to stay in bed past her usual wake-up time. At 9:47 a.m., David's phone buzzed with an automated message. Unusual activity pattern detected. Margaret Sinclair not observed in common areas past typical time frame. David immediately called Elena, who quickly explained that Margaret was having a rough day and was resting in bed with her permission. The alert was exactly what the system was designed to do, but it marked the beginning of David's new habit of checking the camera feeds throughout his workday. At first, it was occasional glances during coffee breaks or between meetings, but as the weeks progressed, David found himself monitoring the feeds more frequently, reassured by the ability to virtually check on Margaret whenever concern crossed his mind. He could see her moving carefully through the house, watch Elena assisting with daily tasks, observe the gentle interactions between his wife and their invaluable helper. What David didn't realize was that Margaret had begun watching too. During her afternoon rest periods, when pain made concentration difficult for any other activity, she would use the iPad David had configured for her to access the system. At first, it was simple curiosity, an odd fascination with seeing her own life from an external perspective. But gradually, Margaret began to notice patterns in Elena's behavior that were invisible from ground level. When viewed from above through the kitchen's ceiling-mounted camera, Elena's movements appeared almost choreographed. She never wasted motion, never seemed uncertain about where to find anything, and moved through their home with a familiarity that seemed to exceed her relatively short time there. More intriguingly, Elena had specific routines during times when she thought the family was asleep or away. Margaret discovered that Elena would often spend extended periods in David's office area during her lunch breaks, always careful to remain just outside the doorway, but positioning herself where she could observe anyone approaching. She would dust the same section of hallway repeatedly while standing in this position, her attention clearly focused on something other than cleaning. Margaret also noticed that Elena made frequent trips to the basement laundry room, far more frequently than their washing schedule would require. The basement was one of the few areas with limited camera coverage, a deliberate choice since it contained only utilities and storage. Elena would disappear down there for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, always emerging with a small load of laundry that seemed insufficient to justify the duration of her absence. Most puzzling were Elena's evening routines after the family had gone to bed. The cameras clearly showed Elena leaving her apartment above the garage around midnight, entering the main house through the kitchen entrance, and moving through the first floor for approximately an hour before returning to her quarters. She carried what appeared to be a small flashlight or phone light, though the house's motion-activated lighting system meant additional illumination wasn't necessary. During these nocturnal wanderings, Elena moved with purpose rather than the casual meandering of someone who couldn't sleep. She would pause at specific locations, always the same ones, for several minutes before moving on. The pattern was consistent. David's office door, the living room where Margaret spent most of her day, the kitchen island where mail and packages were typically placed, and the foyer where visitors were received. Margaret found herself staying awake to watch these midnight excursions, her heart racing with a mixture of concern and growing suspicion. What was Elena looking for during these careful explorations? Why did she feel the need to examine these specific areas when the family was asleep? The young woman's behavior during the day remained exemplary. She continued to provide exceptional care for Margaret, maintaining her warm personality and intuitive understanding of Margaret's needs. But the nocturnal activities painted a different picture, one of someone conducting systematic surveillance of their own. Margaret began taking screenshots of Elena's nighttime movements, documenting the times and locations of her mysterious activities. She told herself she was being paranoid, that there was probably an innocent explanation for everything she was observing. Perhaps Elena was simply restless, or maybe she was checking on Margaret's safety out of professional concern. But deep down, Margaret's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Elena's perfection was beginning to feel less like a blessing and more like a carefully constructed performance. The question that kept Margaret awake during those late-night surveillance sessions was becoming impossible to ignore. Who was Elena Rodriguez really? And what was she actually doing in their home? Margaret's transformation from passive patient to active investigator began on a rainy Thursday morning in November. The pain in her joints had been particularly brutal that week, confining her to bed for extended periods. But her mind had never been sharper. The enforced stillness gave her hours to study the security footage, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. Using the iPad's screenshot function, Margaret had compiled a digital dossier of Elena's activities spanning 3 weeks. The patterns were undeniable once laid out chronologically. Elena wasn't just wandering aimlessly during her midnight excursions. She was conducting systematic searches of their home, and she was getting bolder. The breakthrough came when Margaret discovered the system's audio recording feature. David had mentioned it during the initial setup, but hadn't emphasized its capabilities. The cameras didn't just capture video, they recorded sound with remarkable clarity. Margaret accessed the audio logs for Elena's most recent midnight activity and heard something that made her hands tremble. Elena was talking to someone. The conversations were conducted in whispers, barely audible even with the volume maximized. But Margaret could make out fragments in English and what sounded like Spanish. More chilling was the fact that Elena appeared to be alone during these conversations. She was either talking to herself or speaking to someone through a device. The cameras couldn't detect. Margaret strained to decipher the whispered words, playing segments repeatedly until she could piece together phrases. The clearest snippet came from Tuesday night's excursion. The office is always locked. Need more time. Thursday, when he travels to Hartford, she sleeps heavy on the medication. The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. Elena was discussing her routines, her medication schedule, David's travel patterns. Someone was gathering intelligence about their household, and Elena was the source. Margaret's investigative instincts, dormant since her illness but not dead, kicked into overdrive. She began cross-referencing Elena's activities with David's travel schedule, her own medication times, and even the household's grocery deliveries and service appointments. The correlations were disturbing. Elena's longest basement excursions coincided exactly with Margaret's heaviest medication days, when the pain relief drugs left her groggy and less observant. The young woman's mysterious conversations always occurred on nights before David had early morning meetings or travel commitments. Most unnervingly, Elena's interest in specific areas of the house aligned with the locations where David stored important documents, valuables, and personal information. But Margaret needed more than suspicious behavior patterns. She needed proof of wrongdoing, evidence of Eleanor's actual intentions. The security system's capabilities were more extensive than David had realized, and Margaret began exploring features that required administrative access, using David's login credentials, a risky move that could expose her investigation. Margaret discovered that the system maintained detailed analytics on all recorded individuals. Elena's profile showed fascinating anomalies. Her movement patterns, when analyzed by the AI's behavioral recognition software, exhibited characteristics that the system flagged as inconsistent with stated role and authorized access levels. The software had detected that Elena accessed restricted areas with unusual frequency and demonstrated familiarity with the house layout that exceeded normal learning curves for domestic staff. More significantly, the system had recorded Elena attempting to manipulate camera angles on 17 separate occasions, subtly adjusting positions to create blind spots or avoid direct facial recognition. Margaret's heart pounded as she read the automatically generated behavioral analysis report. Elena had been systematically testing the security system's vulnerabilities, learning its limitations, and adapting her activities to avoid detection. This wasn't the behavior of a helpful maid. It was the conduct of someone planning something far more sinister. The most damaging evidence came from the system's facial recognition database. Margaret accessed Elena's identification profile and discovered something that made her question everything they thought they knew about their seemingly perfect employee. The system had flagged multiple instances where Elena's facial recognition failed to match her initial registration scan. It wasn't a technical error. The discrepancies occurred during specific time periods when Elena appeared to be deliberately altering her appearance. Different hairstyles, subtle makeup changes, even what appeared to be dental modifications that changed the shape of her jawline. The variations were minor but consistent, suggesting someone with experience in appearance modification. Margaret's investigation deepened when she discovered that Elena had been researching the Sinclair family long before her employment began. The smart TV in Elena's apartment above the garage logged all internet activity, and the browsing history painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. Elena had accessed public records about David's business dealings, studied photographs of their home from real estate websites, and even researched Margaret's previous career and social connections. Most chilling were the searches about fibromyalgia symptoms, pain medication effects, and cognitive impairment in chronic pain patients. Elena had been preparing for this job with the thoroughness of someone planning a long-term operation. The financial evidence was equally troubling. Elena's bank account, which David's background check company had verified during the hiring process, showed transactions that didn't align with her stated salary or living expenses. Large deposits appeared at irregular intervals, amounts far exceeding what she could save from her wages, especially considering her claimed financial obligations to family in Colombia. More suspicious were the outgoing transfers. Elena was sending money to accounts in 3 different countries, Colombia as expected, but also Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. The Swiss and Caribbean transfers were substantial and frequent, suggesting either undisclosed income sources or participation in sophisticated financial networks. Margaret's hands shook as she compiled this evidence, realizing that Elena's presence in their home was part of something much larger and more dangerous than simple theft or domestic fraud. The young woman was operating with resources, knowledge, and objectives that indicated professional criminal activity. But the most terrifying discovery came when Margaret traced Elena's previous employment history. The glowing references from other wealthy Boston families weren't fabricated, but they told only part of the story. Margaret contacted Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, the Cambridge socialite, who had provided Elena's most enthusiastic recommendation. "Oh, my dear, Elena was absolutely wonderful," Mrs. Hartwell confirmed during their phone conversation. "So attentive, so capable. I was heartbroken when she left us." "Why did she leave?" Margaret asked carefully. "Well, that was rather sudden, actually, right after my husband's business partner mentioned some concerns about document security. Nothing to do with Elena, of course, but the timing was unfortunate. She said she'd found a better opportunity with a family who needed more medical assistance. Margaret's blood chilled. What kind of document security concerns? Oh, Robert's partner thought someone had been photographing contracts or financial statements. Completely unfounded, I'm sure, but it created such an unpleasant atmosphere. Robert even had the locks changed and installed some sort of monitoring system. Elena was quite understanding about the whole situation, though I could tell her feelings were hurt. The pattern was becoming clear. Elena had left her previous position just as security concerns arose, moving seamlessly to her next target, the Sinclair family. Margaret suspected that if she traced Elena's employment history further back, she would find similar patterns of departure coinciding with missing valuables, security breaches, or financial irregularities. Margaret realized she was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a common thief. Elena appeared to be part of a sophisticated operation targeting wealthy families, using domestic placement as cover for long-term intelligence gathering and potentially more serious crimes. The question now was what to do with this information. Confronting Elena directly would be dangerous. If Margaret's suspicions were correct, the young woman was a professional criminal with unknown resources and capabilities. Calling the police without more concrete evidence might result in Elena's disappearance before authorities could investigate properly. Most challenging was the fact that Margaret's own credibility was compromised by her medical condition. Elena had been careful to position herself as Margaret's trusted caregiver, and any accusations might be dismissed as paranoid delusions brought on by chronic pain and medication. Margaret needed irrefutable proof of Elena's criminal intentions, evidence so compelling that no one could dismiss it as the confused suspicions of a sick woman. She needed to catch Elena in the act of whatever she was really planning. As Margaret reviewed her evidence one more time, preparing to make the most important decision of her investigation, she noticed something that made her heart stop. Elena's most recent midnight conversation, the one Margaret had partially decoded, contained a phrase she had initially missed. Next week, when the husband travels to Geneva, the safe behind the Monet, she keeps the combination in her jewelry box. Elena knew about David's upcoming Switzerland trip. She knew about the hidden safe behind their most valuable painting. And somehow she knew that Margaret kept important access codes in her private jewelry collection. Margaret had never told Eleanor any of these details. The young woman had gathered this intelligence through careful observation, systematic searching, and possibly unauthorized access to their most private spaces. Elena wasn't just planning theft, she was preparing for a comprehensive robbery that would occur during David's absence, when Margaret would be alone and vulnerable. The timeline was accelerating. David's Geneva trip was scheduled for the following week, a 4-day business engagement that would leave Margaret completely dependent on Eleanor's care. Margaret realized with growing horror that she had less than 7 days to expose Eleanor's true intentions before becoming the victim of a meticulously planned crime. But Margaret also realized something else. She finally had the motivation and evidence needed to take action. Elena had made a critical error by revealing specific knowledge about their security measures and private information. Now, Margaret had to find a way to turn the security system Elena had studied so carefully into the very tool that would expose her true nature. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Margaret intended to be ready. Margaret knew she had one chance to expose Elena before David's Geneva trip, and it required a level of deception she'd never attempted in her life. The plan that formed in her mind over the next 48 hours was risky, potentially dangerous, but absolutely necessary. She would have to become as skilled at manipulation as Elena herself. The first step was establishing her credibility. Margaret called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, her fibromyalgia specialist, and scheduled an emergency appointment under the pretense of discussing medication adjustments. What she actually needed was documented proof that her cognitive function was unimpaired. Medical evidence that would support her testimony if Elena's criminal activities were exposed. "Doctor, I've been having some memory issues lately," Margaret began carefully during her appointment. "My husband and some family members think it might be the pain medication affecting my thinking. I need to know if there's any medical basis for their concerns." Dr. Hendricks conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment, testing Margaret's memory, reasoning, and mental clarity through a series of standardized evaluations. The results were definitive. Margaret's cognitive function was well within normal ranges, with no indication of medication-induced impairment. "Your mental acuity is excellent, Margaret," Dr. Hendricks concluded. "Whatever memory issues you've been experiencing are likely stress-related rather than medication-induced. Your fibromyalgia hasn't affected your cognitive abilities at all." Margaret requested written documentation of the assessment, claiming she needed it for insurance purposes. In reality, she needed proof that any accusations she made against Elena couldn't be dismissed as confused ramblings from a medically compromised patient. Phase 2 of Margaret's plan required gathering additional evidence while maintaining her facade of unsuspecting dependency. She began varying her medication schedule slightly, taking her evening pain relievers earlier some nights and later on others. This created opportunities to observe Elena's activities during different time windows. While Elena believed Margaret was consistently sedated, the modified schedule yielded immediate results. On nights when Margaret delayed her medication, Elena's behavior changed noticeably. The young woman would check on Margaret more frequently, sometimes standing in the hallway outside Margaret's bedroom for several minutes, clearly listening for signs of deep sleep before proceeding with her mysterious activities. More importantly, Margaret discovered that Elena's midnight excursions were timed to coincide with the period when Margaret's medication typically reached peak effectiveness. Elena had been studying Margaret's drug regimen and planning her surveillance activities around the times when discovery was least likely. Margaret also began leaving subtle traps throughout the house, minor items positioned in specific ways that would reveal if someone had been searching through her belongings. A particular book slightly askew on her nightstand, a jewelry box closed but not quite aligned with the edge of her dresser, a drawer left open precisely 1 inch. Each morning, Margaret would check these markers and document any changes. The results were damning. Elena was regularly searching Margaret's personal spaces during her afternoon rest periods, when Margaret typically napped due to fatigue. The young woman was methodical and careful, but not perfect. She consistently left traces of her unauthorized access to Margaret's most private possessions. Margaret's most crucial discovery came when she found Elena's actual communication device. Using the security system's motion detection records, Margaret identified a pattern in Elena's movements that led her to a loose floorboard in the basement laundry room. Hidden beneath the board was a sophisticated satellite phone, clearly expensive and designed for untraceable communication. Margaret photographed the device and its hiding place without disturbing anything, but the discovery confirmed her worst fears. Elena wasn't just a lone criminal. She was part of a larger organization with the resources to provide advanced communication equipment and coordinate complex operations. The satellite phone's presence also explained how Elena could receive instructions and provide updates without using traceable cellular networks or internet connections. Her mysterious conversations weren't with accomplices in the house. They were with handlers, directing her activities from an unknown location. Armed with this evidence, Margaret faced the most challenging aspect of her plan. She needed to force Elena into revealing her true intentions while creating undeniable documentation of the criminal plot. This required setting a trap that would capture Elena's confession on the security system's audio recording capability. Margaret's opportunity came when David confirmed the details of his Geneva trip. He would be leaving Monday morning for a 4-day conference, returning Thursday evening. Elena had already volunteered to stay overnight in the main house during David's absence, ostensibly to provide round-the-clock care for Margaret. "I want to make sure you're never alone while I'm gone," David explained over breakfast Sunday morning, with Elena present in the kitchen. "Elena has agreed to sleep in the guest room so she can respond immediately if you need anything during the night." Elena smiled warmly at this announcement, but Margaret caught a glint of satisfaction in her eyes that had nothing to do with caregiving. Dedication. The young woman was getting exactly what she needed, unlimited access to the house while David was away and Margaret was isolated and vulnerable. "That's very thoughtful," Margaret replied, playing her role as the grateful patient. "I always sleep better knowing someone reliable is nearby," but Margaret had no intention of sleeping at all during David's absence. She would be watching Elena's every move, ready to document the attempted robbery and gather evidence of the broader criminal conspiracy. Sunday evening, Margaret implemented the most delicate part of her plan. She needed Elena to believe that Margaret would be more heavily sedated than usual during David's absence, creating the perfect opportunity for the planned heist. Margaret began complaining about increased pain and anxiety related to David's upcoming trip. "I always get nervous when David travels," Margaret confided to Elena while the young woman prepared her evening medications. "The pain seems worse when I'm stressed. Do you think it would be safe to take an extra dose of my sleep medication while he's gone?" Elena's response was perfectly crafted, concerned, caring, and subtly encouraging. "Stress can definitely make fibromyalgia symptoms worse," she agreed. "If you think an extra sleep aid would help you rest better, that might be beneficial. I'll be right here if you need anything." Margaret detected genuine enthusiasm beneath Elena's professional concern. The young woman was clearly pleased by the prospect of Margaret being more deeply unconscious during the critical period. "I'll call Dr. Hendricks tomorrow and ask about adjusting my nighttime medication," Margaret said. "I want to make sure I get proper rest while David's away." Elena nodded approvingly. "That's very wise. Your health should be the top priority." But Margaret had already spoken with Dr. Hendricks, arranging for a prescription of harmless placebo pills that looked identical to her regular sleep medication. Elena would believe Margaret was heavily sedated while she remained fully alert and ready to document whatever Elena had planned. Sunday night, Margaret's preparation intensified. She created detailed backup copies of all the evidence she'd gathered, storing the files in multiple secure locations and emailing encrypted copies to a trusted attorney friend. If something went wrong during the confrontation with Elena, Margaret wanted to ensure the evidence would survive to expose the criminal operation. She also prepared emergency contacts, including direct lines to Detective Sarah Morrison of the Boston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Margaret had researched which department would handle cases involving sophisticated domestic theft operations and identified the specific detective she would need to contact if her suspicions proved correct. Most importantly, Margaret configured the security system to ensure continuous recording of all Elena's activities. She set up automated backups that would preserve footage even if Elena attempted to tamper with the primary storage system. The evidence of Elena's crimes would be captured in real time and preserved regardless of what happened during the confrontation. As Monday morning approached, Margaret felt a mixture of fear and anticipation that reminded her of her old life in high-stakes business negotiations. She was about to face the most dangerous adversary of her life, armed with nothing but intelligence, preparation, and an unshakable determination to protect her family from a sophisticated predator. David left for the airport at 6 a.m. Monday morning, kissing Margaret goodbye and reminding Elena to call immediately if any concerns arose. As soon as his car disappeared down their tree-lined driveway, Margaret felt the atmosphere in the house shift. Elena's demeanor remained perfectly professional, but there was an underlying energy that hadn't been present before, the focused intensity of someone preparing for a long-awaited operation. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Margaret?" Elena asked as she brought breakfast to Margaret's room. "Are you still planning to speak with Dr. Hendricks about adjusting your sleep medication?" "I already called," Margaret replied, maintaining her facade of innocent dependency. "She's sending a stronger prescription to the pharmacy. I should sleep much better tonight." Elena's smile seemed brighter than usual. "That's wonderful. Rest is so important for healing." As Elena left the room, Margaret noticed something different in her movements, a subtle confidence that hadn't been there before. The young woman was no longer acting like a concerned caregiver. She was moving like someone who owned the space, someone who was finally free to pursue her real agenda. Margaret spent the morning watching Elena through the security feeds, documenting every unusual behavior and preparing for what she knew would be a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. Elena had spent months planning whatever was about to happen, but Margaret had spent weeks preparing her own counter-operation, and she intended to be ready for whatever Elena's true intentions revealed. The game of cat and mouse was about to reach its climax, and Margaret was determined to ensure that she would be the one walking away with the truth. Monday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the November air feel thick and oppressive. Margaret had spent the day maintaining her performance. As the anxious, pain-ridden wife while internally preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous night of her life. Elena had been attentive throughout the day, but there was something different in her energy, a barely contained excitement that she disguised as concern for Margaret's well-being. At 8 p.m., Elena brought Margaret her evening medications along, with the new, stronger sleep aid that was actually a harmless placebo. Margaret made a show of reading the prescription label and expressing relief about finally getting proper rest. "Dr. Hendricks said this should help me sleep through the night without waking up from pain," Margaret said, swallowing the fake pill with exaggerated gratitude. "I'm so tired of tossing and turning." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. "Deep sleep is exactly what you need. I'll be right downstairs if you need anything, but hopefully you'll rest peacefully until morning." There was something almost predatory in Elena's smile as she said this, a satisfaction that went far beyond professional caregiving. Margaret recognized the look. It was the expression of someone who believed their carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. By 10 p.m., Margaret had staged her bedroom to appear as though she was deeply unconscious. She arranged pillows under her blankets to create the silhouette of a sleeping body, positioned herself in the walk-in closet with a perfect view of the security monitor, and settled in to watch Eleanor's true nature emerge. The transformation began. At 10:47 p.m., Margaret watched through the security feeds as Elena moved through the house, but this wasn't the gentle, careful Elena who had been caring for her for months. This woman moved with military precision, her every gesture calculated and efficient. She wore dark clothing that Margaret had never seen before, a black, tactical outfit that allowed for silent movement and included what appeared to be professional tools attached to a utility belt. Elena's first stop was David's office. She produced a small electronic device from her belt and attached it to the door's lock mechanism. Within seconds, the lock disengaged with barely a whisper. Margaret watched in fascination and horror as Elena entered the office and immediately disabled the room's security camera by spraying something on the lens that created an opaque film. But Elena had made a critical error. In her confidence, she had forgotten about the hallway camera that captured her face clearly as she worked on the office door. Margaret's hands trembled as she recorded everything, using her phone to create backup documentation of Elena's criminal actions. From her hidden position, Margaret could hear Elena moving through David's office with systematic efficiency. The sounds were those of someone conducting a professional search. Drawers being opened methodically, papers being photographed, safes being accessed with apparent ease. Elena clearly had the combination to David's main safe, information that could only have been obtained through months of careful observation and intelligence gathering. After 37 minutes in the office, Elena emerged carrying a briefcase that Margaret recognized as David's emergency document case. The one containing their most sensitive financial information, legal documents, and investment portfolios. But Elena wasn't leaving with it. Instead, she took it to the kitchen island and began photographing every document with a professional-grade camera that she produced from her equipment belt. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized the scope of Elena's operation. This wasn't simple theft. It was comprehensive financial espionage. Elena was systematically documenting their entire financial structure, legal arrangements, and business relationships. The information she was gathering could be used for identity theft, financial fraud, or worse. But the most chilling moment came when Elena made a phone call using her satellite device. Margaret strained to hear the conversation, adjusting the security system's audio sensitivity to maximum levels. "Package Alpha is secure," Elena reported in a voice completely devoid of her usual warmth. "Full documentation complete. Subject remains unconscious as planned. Proceeding to Phase 2. The response came through clearly enough for Margaret to record, confirmed, execute collection protocol, extraction scheduled for 400 hours. Leave no traces. Margaret's heart pounded as the implications hit her. Elena wasn't working alone, and this wasn't just about stealing documents. There was an extraction planned for 4 a.m., suggesting that Elena intended to disappear completely after completing her mission. The phrase, "leave no traces," carried ominous implications about what might happen to Margaret as the only witness to Elena's true identity. Elena's Phase 2 became clear as she moved to areas of the house that Margaret had never imagined were her targets. The young woman went directly to Margaret's personal jewelry collection, but she wasn't interested in the valuable pieces. Instead, she photographed every item, focusing particularly on pieces that contained hidden compartments or unusual designs. Margaret watched in growing horror as Eleanor located and opened the secret compartment in Margaret's antique jewelry box. The one where she kept emergency access codes, backup passwords, and other critical security information. Elena photographed everything systematically, then returned each item to its exact original position. The violation felt deeply personal. Elena had been studying Margaret's most private habits for months, learning her security measures and planning to exploit her trust in the most comprehensive way possible. This wasn't just criminal, it was psychological warfare disguised as caregiving. Elena's next target was the basement, where she retrieved additional equipment that had apparently been hidden there for weeks. Margaret realized that Eleanor's frequent trips to the laundry room hadn't been about washing clothes. She'd been storing sophisticated burglary equipment in their own home, preparing for this night. The equipment Elena assembled was far beyond anything a simple domestic thief would possess. There were electronic devices for bypassing security systems, professional cameras for document reproduction, and what appeared to be computer hardware for data extraction. Elena was operating with resources that suggested backing from a major Criminal organization. At 12:23 a.m., Elena did something that revealed the true scope of her deception. She accessed Margaret's personal computer using passwords she had apparently observed or obtained through surveillance. Margaret watched in real time as Elena downloaded files, copied personal correspondence, and accessed private accounts that even David didn't know about. Elena was building a complete profile of the Sinclair family's personal and financial life, gathering information that could be used for years of ongoing fraud and manipulation. This wasn't a one-time theft. It was the foundation for long-term exploitation. But Elena's greatest mistake came when she returned to Margaret's bedroom to check on her supposed unconscious victim. Margaret held her breath in the closet as Elena stood in the doorway, observing the fake sleeping form for several minutes. Then Elena approached the bed and did something that revealed her true nature completely. She took photographs of Margaret in what she believed was an unconscious, vulnerable state. The images were clearly being taken for documentation purposes, possibly to prove to her handlers that Margaret had been successfully sedated and posed no threat to their operation. The violation was so profound that Margaret had to suppress a gasp of rage. Elena had been treating her like an object to be documented and catalogued, not a human being deserving of care and respect. Every moment of supposed kindness had been calculated manipulation designed to facilitate this comprehensive betrayal. Elena's final actions before her 4 a.m. extraction were the most revealing. She spent nearly an hour in the house's main server room, accessing their internet network and downloading data that Margaret couldn't fully see, but clearly involved their personal and financial digital footprint. Elena was stealing their entire digital identity, not just their physical valuables. At 3:47 a.m., Elena made her final satellite phone call. Package complete. All protocols executed successfully. Subject remains secured, standing by for extraction. The response chilled Margaret to her core. Confirmed. Cleanup team en route. Eliminate all traces, including the subject. Make it look medical. Margaret's hands shook as she realized that Elena's plan hadn't just been to rob them. It had been to kill her and make it appear that she had died from complications related to her fibromyalgia. David would return from Geneva to find his wife dead, and Elena mysteriously vanished, with no evidence linking the young woman to any criminal activity. Margaret had stumbled into something far more dangerous than domestic theft. Elena was part of a sophisticated criminal organization that targeted wealthy families for comprehensive financial exploitation and was willing to commit murder to protect their operations. But Elena had made one critical error in her careful planning. She had underestimated the woman she had been hired to victimize. Margaret wasn't the helpless invalid that Elena believed her to be. She was a successful businesswoman who had spent her career dealing with complex adversaries, and she had been planning her own operation for weeks. As Elena prepared for her extraction, Margaret prepared for the confrontation that would expose the truth about the woman who had been living in their home, studying their lives, and planning their destruction. The mask had finally fallen completely, revealing not a caring young woman seeking honest work, but a dangerous professional criminal who viewed her victims as nothing more than targets to be exploited and eliminated. Margaret gripped her phone tightly, her evidence complete and her resolve unshakable. Elena had revealed her true nature, but she had no idea that her intended victim had been watching every moment, recording every crime, and preparing to ensure that justice would be served. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Margaret intended to make sure that Elena's carefully planned extraction would become the moment of her downfall. Instead, at 3:52 a.m., Margaret made the most important decision of her life. She could wait for the cleanup team to arrive and hope that law enforcement would respond in time, or she could take control of the situation herself. Margaret chose to fight back. Moving silently from her closet hiding place, Margaret accessed the house's master control system from the bedroom panel that David had installed for her convenience. The security system was more sophisticated than Elena realized, with features that went far beyond simple recording. Margaret had spent the past week learning capabilities that even David didn't know existed. With trembling fingers, Margaret activated the house's lockdown protocol, a feature designed to protect against home invasions by sealing all exterior doors and windows with electromagnetic locks. Elena was now trapped inside, with no way to escape until Margaret chose to release the system. Next, Margaret disabled the house's main power grid, except for essential systems, plunging Elena into darkness while maintaining power to the security cameras and communication equipment. The sudden blackout would force Elena to use her own lighting, making her location visible while disrupting her planned extraction. But Margaret's masterstroke was activating the house's emergency broadcast system. The feature was designed to allow communication with first responders during medical emergencies, but Margaret had reconfigured it to simultaneously alert multiple agencies. With a single command, she sent automated distress signals to the Boston Police Department, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and a private security firm that specialized in organized crime investigations. Each alert included her pre-recorded message, explaining the situation, along with automatic transmission of the security footage showing Elena's criminal activities. Even if something happened to Margaret, the evidence would reach law enforcement within minutes. Elena's reaction to the sudden lockdown was immediate and telling. Instead of confusion or concern about a possible system malfunction, she responded with the trained reflexes of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Margaret watched through the security feeds as Elena drew what appeared to be a weapon from her tactical belt and moved with military precision toward the main electrical panel. "System failure detected," Elena spoke into her satellite phone, her voice now completely devoid of any trace of the warm Colombian accent she had maintained for months. "Proceeding with emergency extraction protocols. Send immediate backup." Margaret's blood chilled as she realized Elena's accent had been completely fabricated. The voice coming through the security system's audio was crisp, educated, and unmistakably American. Elena Rodriguez wasn't even her real name. Everything about her identity had been an elaborate fiction. But Elena's handlers were apparently as prepared as she was. "Negative on backup," came the response. "Local law enforcement activity. Detected. Abort mission and eliminate all evidence, including the primary witness. You have 12 minutes before we pull extraction entirely." Margaret realized she was now in a race against time. Elena had been given 12 minutes to kill her and escape before her criminal organization abandoned the operation entirely. But Margaret had one advantage Elena didn't know about. She wasn't the helpless victim that months of performance had led Elena to believe. Margaret's fibromyalgia was real, but her physical limitations weren't as severe as she had allowed Elena to observe. During her weeks of investigation, Margaret had been secretly rebuilding her strength and mobility, preparing for exactly this scenario. The invalid Elena planned to murder was actually a determined woman ready to fight for her life. Moving through the darkened house with surprising agility, Margaret reached David's office, where she knew he kept an emergency pistol in a biometric safe. Her hands shook as she accessed the weapon, chambered around and checked the safety, skills she had learned years ago but hoped never to use. Elena was moving toward Margaret's bedroom, clearly intending to complete her lethal assignment quickly and efficiently. But when she reached the room and discovered the empty bed with its pillow decoy, her professional composure finally cracked. "Target is not in primary location," Elena reported tersely. Beginning systematic search. 12 minutes may not be sufficient. The response from her handlers was coldly practical. Make it sufficient. Failure is not acceptable. Margaret used Eleanor's confusion to her advantage, activating the house's intercom system from David's office. Her voice echoed through every room as she spoke directly to the woman who had been planning her murder. "Hello, Eleanor. Or should I use your real name?" Eleanor froze in the hallway, weapon drawn, her head swiveling as she tried to locate the source of Margaret's voice. "I know what you are," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know about the satellite phone, the equipment in the basement, and the cleanup team. I've been watching you for weeks, recording everything. The police are already on their way." Elena's response revealed the trained killer beneath the caregiver facade. Instead of panic or attempts at deception, she spoke with chilling calmness. "Mrs. Sinclair, I underestimated you. That was my mistake, but you've only delayed the inevitable. My associates don't leave loose ends, and you've become a significant problem. The only problem here is that you chose the wrong family to victimize," Margaret replied. "Did you really think I built a successful business by being naive about dangerous people?" Through the security feeds, Margaret watched Elena systematically search the house, moving with tactical precision toward David's office. Elena had apparently concluded that Margaret would head for the most defensible position with the best communication equipment. Margaret was ready. She had positioned herself behind David's massive mahogany desk with clear sightlines to both the door and the windows, the loaded pistol within easy reach. More importantly, she had activated every recording device in the office, ensuring that whatever happened next would be documented in multiple formats. Elena appeared in the office doorway at 4:03 a.m., her weapon trained on Margaret's position. But instead of the cowering invalid she expected to find, Elena faced a determined woman who looked nothing like the helpless patient she had been manipulating for months. "You can't win this," Elena said, her voice now carrying a slight Eastern European accent that replaced the fake Colombian inflection. "Even if you kill me, my organization will send others. We don't tolerate interference with our operations." "Your organization made a critical error," Margaret replied, keeping her own weapon steady. "They assumed I was weak because I'm sick, but chronic pain doesn't make someone helpless. It makes them resilient. And you've been underestimating me from the moment you walked into my home." Elena's expression shifted as she realized that Margaret wasn't going to be an easy victim. "Who are you, really?" "I'm someone who spent 20 years negotiating with people far more dangerous than you," Margaret answered. "I've dealt with organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, and corporate sociopaths who would eat you alive. Did you think I wouldn't recognize a predator when one moved into my house?" For the first time since Margaret had known her, Elena looked uncertain. The careful psychology she had used to manipulate Margaret was useless against someone who had been studying her just as intensively. "The difference between us," Margaret continued, "is that I was building a case while you were planning a murder. Every crime you committed tonight was recorded. Every conversation with your handlers was captured. Every piece of evidence you tried to steal was documented. You're not just caught, you're finished." Elena's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. Without lowering her weapon, she glanced at the screen, and Margaret saw her face go pale. "What did your handlers tell you?" Margaret asked. Elena's voice was hollow when she answered. "Mission abort, extract immediately or be abandoned." "And now you realize that criminal organizations don't value loyalty the way you thought they did," Margaret observed. "You're expendable to them, just like you thought I was expendable to you." The sound of approaching sirens reached them both. At the same moment, Margaret's emergency alerts had worked. Law enforcement was arriving in force, probably alerted by the sophisticated security system's automatic protocols. Elena's weapon wavered as she realized her situation had become hopeless. "You don't understand what you've done. These people will come after you and your husband. This doesn't end tonight." "Actually, it does," Margaret said firmly. "Because I didn't just gather evidence against you, I gathered evidence against your entire operation. Your handlers' voices are recorded, their orders are documented, and their communication protocols are compromised. The FBI is about to have everything they need to dismantle your organization." As the sirens grew louder, Elena made her final mistake. Instead of surrendering, she raised her weapon toward Margaret with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. Margaret didn't hesitate. Years of target practice at the shooting range, skills she had maintained even after her diagnosis, guided her hands as she fired twice in rapid succession. Elena dropped to the floor, her weapon clattering across the hardwood as Margaret's shots found their mark. It wasn't a kill shot. Margaret had aimed to disable, not to execute, but Elena's criminal career was definitively over. As law enforcement officers flooded into the house, Margaret remained behind David's desk, weapons safely positioned, hands visible, waiting for professional help to take control of the situation. She had managed to survive. Detective Sarah Morrison was the first to reach Margaret, finding her calm and coherent despite having just fought for her life against a professional killer. "Mrs. Sinclair, are you injured?" Detective Morrison asked, securing Elena's weapon and calling for medical assistance. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "But I have a substantial amount of evidence to share with you about a criminal organization that's been targeting wealthy families across New England." As paramedics attended to Elena's wounds and crime scene technicians began processing the massive amount of evidence Margaret had gathered, Detective Morrison shook her head in amazement. "Most victims in your situation don't survive encounters with professionals like this," she observed. "How did you know to prepare?" Margaret managed a tired smile. "Because I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who has everything to lose." The hours following Elena's capture transformed the Sinclair mansion into a federal crime scene. By 6 a.m., the house was swarming with FBI agents, forensic specialists, and cybersecurity experts who had arrived to process what Detective Morrison described as one of the most sophisticated domestic infiltration operations we've ever encountered. Special Agent Rebecca Torres of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force took charge of the investigation. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had spent her career dismantling criminal networks, but even she seemed impressed by the scope of Elena's operation and the quality of evidence Margaret had compiled. "Mrs. Sinclair, what you've documented here is extraordinary," Agent Torres said, as she reviewed Margaret's meticulously organized files. "Most victims of these operations never realize they're being targeted until it's too late. Your investigation may have prevented dozens of other families from becoming victims." The woman Margaret had known as Elena Rodriguez was, in reality, Katerina Volkov, a 31-year-old former intelligence operative born in Belarus who had been recruited by an international criminal syndicate after being discharged from her country's military for psychological instability. Her real background included advanced training in psychological manipulation, electronic surveillance, and what intelligence agencies euphemistically called asset elimination. Volkov has been operating under dozens of false identities across 3 countries, Agent Torres explained, as Margaret sat in her living room, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm morning. The Elena Rodriguez identity was created specifically for targeting your family. They spent 6 months developing her background, including fabricated employment history and references from compromised sources. Margaret's mind reeled as she processed the implications. The other families who recommended her were either previous victims who had been successfully compromised or were people being coerced through blackmail or threats, Agent Torres confirmed. Mrs. Victoria Hartwell, for instance, had no idea her recommendation was being used. Volkov's organization had access to her personal correspondence and forged the recommendation letter. David had been contacted in Geneva and was flying back immediately, but Margaret found herself grateful for these hours alone to process what had happened. The violation felt even more profound now that she understood the true scale of the deception. Every moment of care, every gesture of kindness, every shared conversation had been calculated manipulation by someone trained in psychological warfare. But the investigation was revealing that Margaret's ordeal was part of something much larger and more dangerous than individual identity theft. Volkov's satellite phone contained communications with handlers across multiple continents, revealing a criminal network that specialized in what they called deep embedding operations. They target wealthy families with specific vulnerabilities. Agent Torres explained, as forensic accountants analyzed the financial data Volkov had stolen. Elderly parents with dementia, sick family members, recent divorces, deaths in the family, anything that creates emotional vulnerability and need for outside help. Then they place operatives as caregivers, housekeepers, nannies, even personal assistants. The operation was staggeringly sophisticated. The organization employed former intelligence operatives, military specialists, and even legitimate healthcare workers who had been recruited or coerced into criminal activity. They maintained an extensive database of wealthy targets, complete with psychological profiles, financial assessments, and detailed infiltration strategies. Volkov's mission wasn't just to rob your family, Agent Torres continued, showing Margaret encrypted files that had been recovered from the satellite phone. She was gathering intelligence for a much larger operation. Your husband's investment firm handles portfolios for hundreds of wealthy clients. The financial information she was stealing could have been used to target dozens of other families. Margaret felt sick as she realized that David's business connections had made them a gateway target. If Volkov had succeeded, the criminal organization would have gained access to the financial details of some of New England's wealthiest families, potentially enabling years of sophisticated fraud and theft. The basement of their home yielded even more disturbing evidence. Hidden beneath the loose floorboard where Margaret had discovered the satellite phone, investigators found a complete surveillance kit including listening devices, micro cameras, and electronic equipment capable of intercepting and copying digital communications. She had been recording your family's private conversations for months, Agent Torres reported. Phone calls, personal discussions, even arguments. The organization was building psychological profiles that would allow them to manipulate family members or exploit personal conflicts. Most chilling was the discovery of what appeared to be contingency plans for multiple scenarios. If the infiltration had been discovered prematurely, Volkov had detailed instructions for discrediting her accusers by claiming they were suffering from medication-induced paranoia or mental instability. If law enforcement had become involved, she had protocols for destroying evidence and disappearing completely. The cleanup team that was supposed to extract her wasn't just coming to help her escape, Agent Torres explained grimly. They were coming to eliminate all evidence of the operation, including any witnesses who could testify about what happened. Margaret shuddered as she realized how close she had come to being murdered and having her death attributed to complications from her medical condition. David would have returned from Geneva to find his wife dead and Elena mysteriously vanished, with no evidence linking the young woman to any criminal activity. The investigation expanded rapidly as other law enforcement agencies became involved. The Department of Homeland Security was interested in the international aspects of the operation. The Treasury Department wanted to trace the financial networks that funded such sophisticated infiltrations. Even Interpol had been contacted regarding similar operations that had been reported in other countries. Margaret's evidence was proving invaluable in identifying other victims. The organization maintained detailed files on successful operations, and investigators were discovering that families across New England had been systematically targeted over the past 5 years. The Pemberton family in Newport, Agent Torres mentioned, referring to one of the files. Their elderly father died of what appeared to be a heart attack 6 months after hiring a new caregiver. We're now ordering an exhumation and autopsy. The Hartford banking family, who had lost millions in what they thought was investment fraud. The Boston shipping heiress, who had died in what appeared to be an accidental fall down her stairs. The Connecticut tech executive, whose trusted personal assistant had disappeared the same day his company's trade secrets were leaked to competitors. All of these incidents were now being investigated as possible crimes committed by the same criminal organization that had targeted the Sinclairs. Margaret's phone rang constantly as news of the operation spread through law enforcement channels. Other potential victims were being contacted and warned. Security companies were updating their protocols. Even domestic placement agencies were being investigated for possible infiltration by criminal operatives. But the most significant development came when Agent Torres received a call from the FBI's cybercrime division. Volkov's communication protocols had led them to a major breakthrough in tracking the organization's leadership. We've identified at least 3 other active operatives currently embedded with families in different states, Agent Torres announced. Simultaneous raids are being planned for this evening. Your investigation may have given us the opening we need to dismantle this entire network. Margaret felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion as she realized that her weeks of careful detective work were leading to the arrest of criminals who had been victimizing families for years. But she also felt a profound sense of violation that would take much longer to heal. "How many families do you think were targeted?" Margaret asked. Agent Torres consulted her notes grimly. "Based on the communications we've intercepted, we estimate at least 40 families across 6 states over the past 3 years. The financial losses alone are probably in the tens of millions, but the psychological damage to the survivors is incalculable." The investigation also revealed the sophisticated vetting process the criminal organization used to select their operatives. Volkov had been specifically chosen for the Sinclair assignment because her psychological profile indicated she could maintain long-term deception without emotional attachment to her victims. She scored exceptionally high on tests measuring manipulation skills and emotional detachment, Agent Torres explained. The organization specifically recruited people who could form convincing emotional bonds with their targets while maintaining complete psychological distance. Margaret thought about all the moments when Elena had seemed genuinely caring, all the conversations that had felt authentically warm and supportive. Knowing that every gesture had been carefully calculated made the betrayal feel even more profound. David finally arrived home at 3 p.m., rushing through the remaining crime scene tape to reach Margaret. His face was haggard from stress and lack of sleep, but his relief at finding her alive and unharmed was overwhelming. "I can't believe this happened," he said, holding her tightly. "I brought that woman into our home to help you, and she was planning to kill you." "She fooled both of us," Margaret replied. "She was a professional who was trained specifically for this kind of operation. We couldn't have known." But privately, Margaret was struggling with guilt about her own naivety. She had sensed that something was wrong for weeks, but had doubted her own instincts because of her medical condition. The experience had taught her that chronic illness didn't make her perceptions less reliable. It had actually sharpened her awareness of behavioral inconsistencies. As the afternoon progressed, Agent Torres provided updates on the broader investigation. The simultaneous raids in other states had been successful, resulting in the arrest of 3 more operatives and the rescue of potential victims who had no idea they were in danger. One family in Connecticut was scheduled for a clean-up operation next week, Agent Torres reported. Their caregiver had been gathering intelligence for 8 months and was preparing to eliminate an elderly couple who had become suspicious of her activities. Margaret realized that her decision to fight back instead of waiting for help had potentially saved lives beyond her own. If she had been killed as planned, the investigation into Volkov's activities might never have occurred, allowing the criminal organization to continue targeting innocent families indefinitely. As evening approached and the forensic teams completed their work, Margaret found herself sitting in the garden where she had taken so many walks with the woman she had known as Elena. The space felt different now, not peaceful, but haunted by the knowledge of how thoroughly she had been deceived. Agent Torres joined her on the garden bench as the sun set over Boston Harbor. "Mrs. Sinclair, I want you to know that what you did was extraordinarily brave. Most people in your situation would never have suspected they were being targeted, let alone gathered enough evidence to expose an international criminal operation." Margaret managed a tired smile. "I spent my whole career dealing with people who weren't what they seemed to be. I just never expected to need those skills in my own home. The evidence you compiled is going to help us prosecute not just Volkov, but potentially dozens of other criminals involved in this network." Agent Torres continued, "You may have prevented hundreds of other families from becoming victims." As the investigative teams finally departed and Margaret and David were alone in their home, for the first time since the ordeal began, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at surviving, anger at being victimized, satisfaction at exposing the truth, but also a profound sadness about the loss of trust that would affect the rest of their lives. "How do we ever feel safe again?" David asked as they stood in their living room, looking at the spaces where Eleanor had moved so confidently for months. "We learn from this," Margaret replied. "And we make sure that other families don't have to go through what we did." 6 months after the night that changed their lives forever, Margaret stood in a federal courthouse in downtown Boston, preparing to testify in what had become one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in New England history. The case had grown far beyond Katerina Volkov's infiltration of their home. It now encompassed a criminal network spanning 12 countries and involving over 200 identified victims. Margaret's fibromyalgia had actually improved in the months following the confrontation. Her doctors attributed it partly to the psychological relief of surviving a life-threatening situation, but Margaret knew it was more than that. She had reclaimed her sense of agency and purpose, transforming from victim to advocate in ways that energized her despite the physical challenges she continued to face. "Mrs. Sinclair, are you ready?" asked Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, the federal prosecutor who had taken over the case from local authorities when its scope became apparent. Walsh was a formidable woman in her 50s who specialized in organized crime prosecutions and had been genuinely impressed by the quality of evidence Margaret had compiled. "I've been ready for this moment since the night I realized who Elena really was," Margaret replied, adjusting the lightweight blazer she had chosen for her testimony. She had lost weight during the investigation and legal proceedings, but her resolve had only strengthened. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officials, and family members of other victims who had been identified through Margaret's evidence. Katerina Volkov sat at the defendant's table, looking nothing like the warm, caring young woman who had lived in their home. Her hair was now its natural dark brown, rather than the chemically lightened chestnut she had worn as Elena. Her expression was cold and calculating, showing no trace of the manufactured warmth that had made her so convincing as a caregiver. Margaret's testimony was scheduled to be the prosecution's centerpiece, the detailed account of how she had discovered and documented Volkov's criminal activities. But more importantly, her evidence had enabled investigators to unravel the entire criminal organization, leading to arrests in 7 countries and the recovery of millions in stolen assets. The defense is going to try to portray you as a paranoid woman whose illness affected your judgment, Attorney Walsh had warned during their preparation sessions. They'll claim that you misinterpreted innocent behavior and created an elaborate conspiracy theory because of medication side effects. Margaret had smiled grimly at that prediction. Let them try. I have 300 hours of recorded evidence and the testimony of federal agents who confirmed every single thing I documented. Indeed, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. In addition to Margaret's meticulous documentation, investigators had recovered Volkov's complete operational files, including detailed profiles of dozens of targeted families, recorded conversations with her handlers, and even training materials that revealed how the organization selected and prepared their operatives. The trial had already heard testimony from other victims whose families had been infiltrated by operatives from the same criminal network. The Hartford banking family, whose patriarch had died under suspicious circumstances. The Newport shipping heiress, whose accidental death was now being prosecuted as murder. The Connecticut technology executive whose trade secrets had been stolen by his trusted personal assistant. Each case followed the same pattern: a vulnerable family situation, a seemingly perfect caregiver or domestic employee, months of intelligence, gathering, and then either theft, murder, or both. Margaret's case was unique only because she had detected the deception in time to prevent its deadly conclusion. When Margaret's name was called, she walked to the witness stand with steady steps, refusing to use the walking assistance that her doctors sometimes recommended on difficult days. She wanted the jury to see her as a credible witness, not a frail woman whose perceptions might be compromised by illness. Attorney Walsh began with Margaret's background, establishing her credentials as a successful businesswoman who had built a multi-million-dollar property development company through careful attention to detail and the ability to assess people's true motivations. Mrs. Sinclair, when you hired the defendant, what was your initial impression? Elena seemed perfect, Margaret answered honestly. Too perfect, as it turned out. She anticipated my needs in ways that felt almost supernatural. She knew things about our house and family that she shouldn't have known after only a few days. Of employment, can you describe the first time you became suspicious of her behavior? Margaret walked the jury through her growing awareness of Elena's inconsistencies, the expensive personal items that didn't match her claimed financial situation, her unusual familiarity with their home's layout, and most importantly, her nocturnal activities captured by the security cameras. I realized that Elena was conducting systematic surveillance of our home during hours when she believed I was unconscious from pain medication, Margaret testified. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. She was methodically gathering intelligence about our security measures, financial information, and daily routines. The prosecution then introduced the audio and video evidence that Margaret had compiled, playing excerpts of Volkov's recorded conversations with her handlers. The jury listened in stunned silence as they heard Volkov discussing Margaret's medication schedule, David's travel plans, and the location of valuables with the detached professionalism of someone planning a military operation. When Attorney Walsh played the recording of Volkov's final conversation, the one where she received orders to eliminate all evidence, including the primary witness, several jury members visibly recoiled. The cold calculation in Volkov's voice as she acknowledged orders to murder Margaret was chilling even in the clinical environment of the courtroom. Mrs. Sinclair, at what point did you realize your life was in danger? When I heard Elena's handler tell her to make it look medical, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the traumatic memories. I realized they intended to kill me and make it appear that I had died from complications related to my fibromyalgia. My husband would have returned from his business trip to find me dead with no evidence of foul play. The defense attorney, an expensive criminal lawyer named Marcus Brennan, who had been hired by sources that federal investigators were still trying to identify, attempted to undermine Margaret's credibility during cross-examination. Mrs. Sinclair, isn't it true that fibromyalgia can cause cognitive difficulties, including paranoia and misinterpretation of normal events? Margaret had been prepared for this attack. Mr. Brennan, I underwent comprehensive cognitive testing specifically to address that concern. The results showed that my mental faculties are completely unimpaired. More importantly, everything I documented was confirmed by federal investigators who found additional evidence that I wasn't even aware of. But you were taking powerful pain medications that can affect judgment and perception, weren't you? I was taking prescribed medications under medical supervision, Margaret replied firmly. And on the night I gathered the most crucial evidence, I was taking placebo pills that your client believed were stronger sleep aids. I was completely alert and clear-headed when I recorded her criminal activities and death threats. Brennan tried several other approaches, suggesting that Margaret had misunderstood innocent behavior, that the security footage could be interpreted differently, that Volkov's conversations might have been taken out of context. But each attack was met with specific, documented evidence that made his arguments appear desperate. The most powerful moment of Margaret's testimony came when Attorney Walsh asked her to describe the personal impact of Volkov's deception. The violation isn't just about what she stole or planned to steal, Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of months of processing the betrayal. It's about the systematic exploitation of human compassion. Elena studied my illness, my vulnerabilities, my fears, and she weaponized every piece of information against me. She turned my need for help into a tool for my own destruction. Margaret paused, collecting herself before continuing. But she made one critical error. She assumed that chronic illness makes someone weak. In reality, living with fibromyalgia taught me to pay attention to subtle signals, to trust my instincts, and to fight for myself when no one else will. The skills that helped me build a successful business were the same skills that saved my life. The jury was clearly moved by Margaret's testimony, but the prosecution wasn't finished. They called Agent Torres, who walked the jury through the broader investigation that Margaret's evidence had enabled. Mrs. Sinclair's documentation was the breakthrough we needed to identify and dismantle an international criminal organization, Agent Torres testified. Her evidence led directly to the arrest of 23 operatives across 7 countries and the prevention of at least 12 planned murders. The agent explained how Margaret's investigation had revealed the organization's sophisticated training programs, their psychological profiling of targets, and their willingness to commit murder to protect their operations. Without Mrs. Sinclair's courage and intelligence, this criminal network would still be operating, and dozens more families would have become victims, Agent Torres concluded. Additional witnesses included forensic accountants who had traced millions in stolen assets, cybersecurity experts who had analyzed the organization's communication networks, and even a former operative who had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. The former operative, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had infiltrated families in California using similar methods, provided chilling insights into the organization's operations. We were trained to become whatever our targets needed most, Chen testified. If they needed a caregiver, we became the perfect caregiver. If they needed a friend, we became their best friend. We studied psychology, acting, even medical techniques, to make our performances completely convincing. Chen explained how operatives were selected for specific assignments based on psychological profiles of both the criminal and the target family. Katerina was chosen for the Sinclair assignment because her psychological evaluation showed she could maintain long-term deception without developing emotional attachments, Chen revealed. She was specifically selected because she tested high for traits that would allow her to kill someone she had been caring for without psychological distress. The defense attempted to present Volkov as a victim of coercion, claiming she had been forced into criminal activity through threats against family members. But prosecutors easily demolished this argument by showing evidence of Volkov's voluntary recruitment, her enthusiastic participation in training programs, and her requests for increasingly challenging assignments. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Margaret sat in the courtroom with David, Agent Torres, and other victims' families, waiting for a verdict that would determine whether justice would be served for years of systematic criminal activity. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts, including attempted murder, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering. Katerina Volkov would spend the rest of her life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Margaret felt no satisfaction or triumph, only a profound sense of closure. The woman who had invaded her home, studied her vulnerabilities, and planned her murder had been held accountable for her crimes. But more importantly, Margaret's investigation had prevented countless other families from experiencing the same betrayal and danger. The criminal organization that had operated with impunity for years had been dismantled, its operatives arrested, and its victims finally able to find peace. Outside the courthouse, Margaret was surrounded by reporters asking about her experience and her plans for the future. She had become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, and several publishers had approached her about writing a book about her investigation. Mrs. Sinclair, what message would you give to other people who might find themselves in similar situations? One reporter asked. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. Trust your instincts, she said finally. If something feels wrong, investigate it. Don't let anyone convince you that your perceptions are unreliable because of illness, age, or any other factor. Sometimes the people who seem too good to be true really are. 2 years after the trial that sent Katerina Volkov to prison for life, Margaret Sinclair stood before an audience of 300 law enforcement professionals at the National Conference on Domestic Security. She had been invited as the keynote speaker to discuss her experience and the lessons learned from one of the most sophisticated criminal infiltration cases in modern history. The auditorium was filled with FBI agents, local detectives, security consultants, and victim advocates who had come to hear from the woman who had single-handedly exposed an international criminal network. Margaret no longer needed assistance walking to the podium. Her fibromyalgia remained a daily challenge, but she had learned to manage it while pursuing a new career that gave her life unprecedented meaning and purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret began, her voice clear and confident, I want to start by acknowledging something that many of you already know. I am not a law enforcement professional. I'm not a trained investigator. I'm a woman with a chronic illness who happened to pay attention when someone tried to manipulate my vulnerability into a weapon against me. The audience listened intently as Margaret outlined the key indicators that family members and caregivers should watch for when hiring domestic help. Her presentation included real examples from Volkov's operation and similar cases that had been uncovered in the aftermath of the investigation. The most dangerous criminals are often the ones who seem the most helpful, Margaret explained, clicking through slides that showed photos of various operatives who had been arrested across the country. They study their targets intensively, learning exactly what each family needs most, and then they become the perfect solution to those needs. Margaret's work had evolved far beyond simply telling her story. She had become a consultant for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, helping to develop profiles of domestic infiltration operatives and training materials for recognizing sophisticated deception. Her unique perspective as both a successful businesswoman and a survivor of professional manipulation had proven invaluable in understanding how these criminals operated. She had also established the Sinclair Foundation for Domestic Security, a non-profit organization that provided security assessments and safety education for families who employed domestic help. The foundation had already prevented several potential infiltrations by identifying suspicious patterns in applicants' backgrounds and behavior. One of the most important things we've learned, Margaret continued her presentation, is that these criminal organizations specifically target families during vulnerable periods. Serious illness, recent deaths, divorces, or major life transitions create exactly the emotional environment that makes people more susceptible to manipulation. During the question and answer period that followed her presentation, a young FBI agent raised her hand. Mrs. Sinclair, what advice would you give to families who are afraid to hire domestic help because of cases like yours? Margaret smiled at the question. Don't let fear prevent you from getting help when you need it, but do your homework. Verify everything independently. Trust your instincts. And remember that the best employees are usually the ones who have small flaws and normal human inconsistencies. Perfection should make you suspicious, not grateful. After the conference, Margaret returned home to Boston, where the mansion had been transformed into something completely different from the house where Volkov had once moved through shadows planning murder. David had initially wanted to sell the property and start fresh somewhere else, but Margaret had convinced him that running away would give their trauma more power than it deserved. Instead, they had renovated extensively, creating a home office where Margaret ran her foundation and consulting work. The security system had been completely redesigned, not to spy on domestic employees, but to provide the family with genuine peace of mind through transparent, ethical monitoring that respected everyone's privacy and dignity. Margaret's relationship with chronic illness had also evolved in unexpected ways. While her fibromyalgia remained a daily reality requiring careful management, she had discovered that having a sense of purpose and agency actually reduced her pain levels significantly. Her doctors were amazed by her improvement, but Margaret understood that psychological empowerment could be as healing as any medication. I spent so many years feeling like my illness made me weak, Margaret reflected during an interview with a national news magazine. But surviving Elena's infiltration taught me that chronic pain had actually made me more observant, more resilient, and more determined than I had ever realized. My supposed weakness became my greatest strength. David had also changed in profound ways. The experience of nearly losing Margaret to a criminal he had unknowingly invited into their home had made him more protective, but also more appreciative of his wife's intelligence and capability. He had taken early retirement from his investment, firm to support Margaret's foundation work and spend more time together. I used to think I was protecting Margaret by handling everything myself, David admitted in the same interview. But she saved both our lives by trusting her own judgment and refusing to be dismissed as a paranoid, sick woman. I learned to listen to her instincts instead of trying to manage her concerns away. The couple had decided not to hire any live-in, domestic help, instead choosing to work with a small, local cleaning service that had been thoroughly vetted and operated with complete transparency. Margaret had regained enough strength and mobility to handle most daily tasks herself, and they had modified their home to accommodate her physical limitations without requiring constant assistance from others. Margaret's work with the FBI had led to the development of new protocols for investigating domestic crimes involving sophisticated deception. Her case had become a teaching tool at the FBI Academy, where new agents learned to recognize the signs of professional manipulation and long-term criminal infiltration. The Sinclair case changed how we approach domestic crime investigations, explained Agent Torres, who had remained close friends with Margaret after the trial. We now understand that victims of these operations are often highly intelligent, people who detected genuine threats, but were dismissed by others who couldn't believe such sophisticated deception was possible. The ripple effects of Margaret's investigation continued to unfold years after Volkov's conviction. International law enforcement agencies had used the intelligence gathered from the criminal network to prevent similar operations in other countries. The training methods and psychological profiles that Margaret had helped document were being used to identify and arrest operatives before they could harm their intended victims. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story had inspired other potential victims to trust their instincts when something felt wrong about the people they had invited into their homes. The Foundation regularly received calls from family members who had noticed concerning patterns in their domestic employees' behavior and wanted professional assessment of their concerns. Not every suspicious caregiver is a professional criminal, Margaret acknowledged during her foundation's annual fundraising gala, but every family deserves to feel secure in their own home, and that security comes from being informed, prepared, and willing to investigate when something doesn't feel right. The evening's guest speaker was Detective Morrison, who had been promoted to head the Boston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, partly based on her exemplary work on Margaret's case. Margaret Sinclair represents everything we hope civilian crime victims can become, Detective Morrison told the gathered supporters. She refused to be helpless. She gathered evidence methodically. She trusted the legal system to deliver justice. And most importantly, she turned her traumatic experience into a force for protecting others. As the gala ended and guests departed into the Boston night, Margaret stood with David on the balcony of their renovated home, looking out over the harbor where ships moved through darkness, guided by lighthouse beams. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. Margaret had become a lighthouse herself, helping other families navigate the dangerous waters of modern domestic crime. "Do you ever regret fighting back instead of just calling the police immediately?" David asked, a question he had posed several times over the years. Margaret considered her answer carefully, as she always did. "If I had called for help without gathering evidence first, Elena would have disappeared, and the entire criminal organization would still be operating. Dozens of other families would have become victims. Sometimes you have to take risks to protect not just yourself, but people you'll never meet." She paused, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the harbor. "Besides, I learned something important about myself that night. Chronic illness doesn't make you weak. It teaches you to fight smarter, not harder. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs." Margaret's story had become more than a tale of survival. It was proof that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges could rise to meet them with courage, intelligence, and determination. Her legacy wasn't just exposing one criminal, but empowering countless others to trust their instincts and fight for their own safety. In a world where vulnerability was often seen as weakness, Margaret Sinclair had shown that it could become the foundation for unimaginable strength. And in helping others recognize that same potential within themselves, she had transformed her darkest experience into her greatest contribution to the world. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, a beacon of safety for travelers. navigating treacherous waters, just as Margaret's story would continue guiding families toward security for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.